Rioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 245 Travel, Expansion, and Leisure. Now, in the past, we've talked a little bit about people traveling. That wasn't something new to the world. It was not uncommon for especially wealthier classes of people to travel around. A lot of talk in the 17th century about the grand tours of the 17th and 18th centuries, where the wealthier class of people would go to Paris and London and Rome, and then they would go elsewhere. And some might even travel as far as to Palestine and to the Ottoman Empire and travel around the Holy Land and all of these kind of things to sort of expand their horizons, see things that maybe they wouldn't have seen otherwise. In some cases, they would go to North America. If you were a soldier, of course, you traveled because you traveled to wherever the war was taking place. If you were a business merchant who had to travel around for business in order to make money, you also would be someone who traveled around a lot. There were artists and poets and singers and songwriters who traveled a bit, depending on patrons and things like that. But probably until I would say the 1800s, most people, especially most poorer people, didn't move around that much. There was no financial ability to just pick up and travel wherever you wanted. You were basically, your main travel point in your life might be a 20-mile jaunt to the town near to you. You don't necessarily own a horse, or if you do, it's used for labor. So you're on foot. You don't necessarily have a ship or a boat or a plane or a train or anything like that, obviously. So you don't have quicker ways of getting anywhere. And the costs of these trips would be quite pricey. So it wasn't like you could just pick up and go. We have people who moved, of course, people went to colonies and went to other countries and other locations for various reasons. But that was a once in a lifetime thing. And they didn't typically come back. And you didn't just vacation, at least not if you were. And when I say a normal, think of a farmer, think of someone who's in, an apprentice or in a very low trade where they wouldn't necessarily have the income to just pick up and take time off. The exceptions to that would be the removals and attempts to get to holy places, to go on pilgrimages, like in Islam, the idea that once in your life you need to go to the Hajj and to see that and to experience it and to be a part of it. In Christendom, it was a thing that people were supposed to go to either the Holy Land or to Rome. That was kind of the original idea of a pilgrimage. Eventually, they developed it. If I was effectively trying to, see the value of something outside of the religious value, they started to develop local holy sites that you would travel to instead. Even if you go back into like the Iron Age and into Roman periods, there are places like baths and things where people would travel to either to, you know, for health reasons or for, say, purchasing, blessings or curses to try and gain favor with various gods. All of these kind of things are kind of why people moved around a little bit. And very few of those were for leisure. The idea that you would just pick up and go and travel somewhere for a few days and come back just wasn't really in the cards for most people. The cost alone would be astronomical. The ability would be difficult at best, and the travel itself would be difficult at best. You have, your options were horses or boats because anything else is too slow. Feet, you're not going to walk from here to say, from say Cardiff to, Great Yarmouth or even up to Scotland. You're just not going to do that willingly unless you have no choice, unless there's a reason why you're doing it. And this is why I say up until this period that has been kind of what we've talked a lot about. And that effectively is what mitigates travel for the majority. And of course, after this period, as we get into the 18th and especially the 19th century, we start to see this change. Prior to this, we, of course, had wealthy people who had country homes. They would travel to cottages. They would go to different lakeside areas or seaside areas for their health benefits. And in part, as wealth was spread in the country, especially with the expanding middle class, came the desire to get away from the stinking, polluted, and disease ravaged urban areas. This meant one of the first big areas for tourism became beach resorts. Before the Victorian era, the coast was largely the domain of fishermen, traders, and shipbuilders. Seaside visits, if they occurred at all, were the preserve of the elite, like King George III, who popularized bathing in Weymouth in the late 18th century. But by the 1840s and 1850s, a new kind of traveler was arriving, this time by a new device, the train. And this was the British working and middle classes. Encouraged by a growing belief in the health benefits of sea air and salt water, and propelled by the cheaper rail travel and more flexible factory schedules, entire families began heading to the coast for their first taste of leisure or holidays. One contemporary newspaper described the scenes in these glowing terms. The rail, quote, brings the people by the thousands, pouring them out into the piers and promenades. There is laughter and there is life. A nation once wedded to work discovers the joy of rest, end quote. Now, we know for a fact that part of this isn't because suddenly there was all these noble manufacturers who suddenly decided that their laborers needed to have a rest period. It was more about the fact that there became a lot more labor unrest, and the way to meet some of the problems that were in the labor unrest was to offer different options to people. And this was one of those options. Victorian society, of course, was steeped in a moral code, and yet seaside resorts found a way to balance decorum and delight, as they call it. Bathing machines, wooden huts on wheels that allowed women to enter the seas without revealing so much as an ankle. Men and women bathed in segregated zones, and modesty was strictly observed. I would say that's in certain areas, let's be clear. You can't have all of this everywhere. At the same time, piers, bandstands, penny arcades, and donkey rides filled the days with cheerful distractions. English towns like Blackpool, Brighton, and Scarborough flourished into bustling playgrounds. Seaside guides and postcards advertised the invigorating air and the restorative waters and the wholesome entertainment. Of course, all of this is backed by the arrival of the rail. The story of the railways in Wales began not with passengers but with freight. One of the earliest examples was the Penderyn tramroad, in which in 1804 saw Richard Trevithick's experimental steam locomotive make its historical first journey from Merthyr Tydfil to Abercoed, hauling iron from the Cyfarthfa ironworks. Though the engine proved too heavy for the cast iron rails, it did signal the start of steam's promise. Later, the Taff Vale Railway, established in 1836, became Wales's first public steam railway. Opening in 1840, it linked Merthyr with Cardiff, carrying both goods and people. According to the railway historian John Davies, the Taff Vale carried 157,000 passengers in its first year, showing the appetite for rail travel was already growing. Railway entrepreneurs like Isambard Kingdom Brunel were instrumental, as Brunel's South Wales Railway, completed in 1856, connected industrial south to the rest of the UK via Gloucester, and later expanded west towards Milford Haven. His vision of tying together industrial regions with coastal ports laid the foundation for passenger service to piggyback on freights and infrastructure. Of course, this meant it was a new kind of journey. By the mid-century, rail travel had become part of the everyday life of Britons. The Cambrian Railway, established in 1864, expanded passenger access into mid and North Wales, linking Shrewsbury to Aberystwyth, Barnmouth, and Pwllheli. For Victorian urban dwellers, these new connections opened the door to rural beauty and ancient myth. One compelling example is in the 1860s in the travels of George Borrow, who in 1862's book Wild Wales and Its People, Language, and Scenery became a guide and an inspiration for English tourists. Though Borrow largely traveled on foot, by the 1870s many were following his footsteps, but this time by railway. A local figure who benefited directly from the railway was Mary Jane Evans, a preacher's daughter from Glamorgan. In the 1870s, she traveled with her father to revivalist meetings by train, something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. She later credited these journeys with shaping her love of public speaking and performance. Railways like the Vale of Rheidol line, opened in 1902 with planning in the 1890s, later formalized these journeys into scheduled tour excursions, particularly for those seeking the picturesque. Of course, nowhere was the impact of steel rail more visible than in Wales's seaside towns. Llandudno, often called the Queen of the Welsh resorts, grew dramatically after the railway arrived in 1858. George and Elizabeth Mostyn, landowners in Llandudno, worked with railway planners to develop promenades, hotels, and the iconic Great Orme Tramway, completed in 1902. Though a little later, its roots lie in the railway boom of the 19th century. An 1865 travel guide wrote, quote, Llandudno is a treasure, a jewel at the sea's edge, its fine promenade flanked by cliffs, and freshened by the Irish Sea's eternal breath, end quote. So you can see there's this movement, there's this draw to try and get away from it all, to use a modern parlance. And that driving that desire was the fact that now it was a lot easier, it was a lot cheaper, it was a lot more convenient to hop a rail and travel by train to the next destination. And it expanded the ability to get out and about. And the one thing you have in Britain that maybe you don't have in other locations is you have a smaller country where it's easier to get trains here and there and everywhere, unless you're in places like the Highlands in Scotland or in Wales, where the mountains can make things tricky. And it's not like trying to cross an entire continent the way it would be in North America. And so you didn't have like just one train line, you had many. And I know currently, if we're going to reflect on current politics, which I don't like doing, but we'll just reflect on it a little bit, one of the great arguments that still goes on to this day is about how much train travel is actually being benefited in Wales with the expense that's being made in England. And that is not a new argument. You can go back even in the 30 years of my experience living in and being involved in Welsh history and politics and life. That's an old argument. And I'm sure it was an argument going back to the 40s and the 30s and, take it as far back as you want. The advent of the automobile would change it even more, but certainly in this instance, that was kind of the first kickoff to a lot of, the ability for people to get around and suddenly start to see areas that they'd only really ever heard of. If you think about it, somebody living in London may have never ever stepped outside of London to this point. Now all of a sudden has access to all sorts of areas they would never have seen except for in picture books where there was likely just drawings for most of it or bad photos. So you have a very different concept and a sense of awe and wonder coming out of this for a lot of people. Now, with that, the Inland Snowdon Mountain Railway opened in 1896, and it became a marvel of engineering because the construction in these mountain areas was more risky. And 2 workers, in fact, did die during the building of it, and its initial journey was marred by a derailment. Still, it soon became a beloved institution. Victorian climbers and photographer Elizabeth Hawkins Whitshed, also known as Lizzie LeBlonde, wrote about Snowdon's beauty and the thrill of ascending the roof of Wales in comfort. Rail also allowed for the growth of religious tourism. Events like the Festival to flourish on a national scale, drawing visitors from across the UK and overseas. This meant of course, that leisure was for the first time a democratic event. Anybody could do it if they had a small amount of money. It wasn't like in the past where it was done by a very, very small cadre of people. The most profound change brought by the Victorian seaside boom was this, as I said, democratization of it. For the first time in British history, working class families were not only permitted to take holidays, they were actively encouraged to do so. This shift wasn't just cultural, it was legal and logistical. The introduction of the Bank Holiday Act of 1871, spearheaded by Liberal MP Sir John Lubbock, gave workers several guaranteed days off. These holidays coincided with the rise of the cheap railway excursion, sometimes costing as little as a shilling for a return ticket, organized by the companies like Thomas Cook, interestingly, and later by trade unions, churches, and friendly societies. By the 1880s, trainloads of people were streaming from industrial towns like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool to Welsh resorts like Rhyl and Llandudno. Many of these visitors were on day trips, carrying packed lunches and little luggage. Others scraped together funds to rent boarding house rooms for a week, often bringing entire extended families. Victorian reformers view this growing movement with optimism. They believed the seaside holiday offered a moral and physical renewal for the working class, and campaigners like Samuel Smiles wrote, quote, "The sea restores the body, but importantly, it restores the character. What better remedy for the vice and fatigue than a week by the waves?" End quote. Factory owners and religious leaders saw seaside holidays as a way to promote temperance and family values. I can't help but have a bit of irony with all of this, but we'll just, we'll brush by that. And Sunday schools were organized and these annual seaside outings for children. Some Welsh nonconformist chapels even set up temperance boarding houses, often to offer sober accommodation. These Victorian resorts, of course, weren't just escapes. They helped to forge a modern identity. They were where the people first saw pantomimes, tasted ice cream for the first time, and heard brass bands play popular tunes. For many, the trip to the seaside was their only time away from their home each year. And in Wales, this tourism boom contributed to a new kind of cultural exchange. English visitors discovering Welsh towns and Welsh businesses learning how to cater to a more diverse clientele. Of course, this meant that Wales was now on display because more people were starting to learn about it. As more English tourists arrived, the Welsh landscape began to be commercialized. Francis Firth, a well-known Victorian photographer, published collections of Welsh scenery, selling them as postcards and books. His work popularized the idea of Wales as a land of legends and played into the romantic and sometimes patronizing narrative that was found there in that argument. The town of Bethgelert, for example, was heavily promoted in travel brochures. The legend of Gelert, the faithful hound, was increasingly presented as fact to appeal to sentimental tourists. Locals both resented and benefited from this tourist-driven narrative crafting. For those of you who might not know, Gellert the hound ended up, his master died, and he stayed by the side of the grave even after his master died, even though people tried to get him away from it. And of course, most people believe this is just a myth, but it did set up this idea that it was real and people would come from all over to see it. It's the same way why, if you think about it, you have, St. David stopped here. You got to check this out if you're a Catholic who believes in the saints and wants to worship the saints. Or St. Mary sat by this well, and so there's a lot of health benefits of sitting by this well. All of these things are very much a town promoting itself. And I think that's something we have to keep in mind, that these myths and legends that we hear about in these communities come out of a sense of trying to draw people there. And of course, sometimes you draw people there, people may not love it as much as they maybe thought it was initially. Think of currently the tourist backlashes that are happening in Barcelona and places around Europe where There is now a perception of over tourism and people are too much in areas and we'll talk about it in a bit, the reaction some Welsh people have with English people buying homes and cottages in Wales to only use as a holiday home and the reaction to that. And of course, mentioning that, let's get into the tension, shall we? The arrival of mass tourism wasn't always welcomed by everyone. In many Welsh coastal towns, the sudden and seasonal influx of English speaking visitors strained local resources and upended daily life. In Rhyl, which transformed rapidly from a quiet fishing village into a bustling holiday resort, longtime residents complained of the noise, drunkenness, and overcrowding. A letter to the North Wales Chronicle in 1874 bemoaned, quote, "Once our peaceful promenade is now overrun with hawkers, children, and men of questionable character. Is this the progress we were promised?" End quote. Boarding house owners and shopkeepers often welcomed the economic opportunity, but others resented the erosion of Welsh culture and the encroachment of English dominance. There were reports of local children being scolded for speaking Welsh to visitors, and complaints that the prices were rising beyond what locals could afford. Does this sound familiar? In Llandudno, town officials debated whether to prioritize Welsh residents or cater fully to the needs of the middle-class tourists. Tensions occasionally surfaced in the press. A local councillor in 1886 warned, quote, "We risk losing the soul of this town if we continue to reshape it solely for the benefit of those who neither know us nor share our ways." End quote. Religious leaders, especially nonconformists, were also uneasy about the types of entertainment seaside towns began offering, from music halls to fortune tellers to dancing and theater, and campaigns were then launched to ban Sunday amusements, close pubs earlier, and restrict the unwholesome entertainment on the pier. As I said, for every time they're saying, well, we had this, we have that, there's always a back heel to this. And the reality of it is that it's never going to stay that way. This idea that it's going to be this moral upbringing and this Victorian idealist ideal about it is never going to be the way it was going to actually work out. We all know that. And despite these tensions, the movement of working class holidaymakers was viewed with pride by many social commentators. Welsh historian John Davies later observed, quote, "The sight of miners' families from the valleys walking barefoot along Aberystwyth seawall was to some a revolution in itself." End quote. Still, even in the democratization of leisure, it had hierarchies. The middle class rented private villas or stayed in prestigious hotels, while the working class families crammed into attic rooms or cheap boarding houses. Separate spaces, such as the first and third class rail carriages, were mirrored at the seaside in separation between exclusive promenades and public bathing beaches. Language and culture also came under pressure. Some boarding schools discouraged Welsh speaking, even as tourists bought authentic, quotes, Welsh souvenirs. Some individuals found empowerment through this tourism. John Thomas, for example, a harpist from Gwynedd, made a living performing for tourists at hotels and stations, proudly representing his culture on his own terms. However, that's not everybody's experience, that's not everybody's life, and certainly if you're in an area which has generally been a small town or village where you knew everybody and everybody had been around, and especially in North Wales, they predominantly all speak Welsh, suddenly have this influx of tourists who come from busy urban centers who don't necessarily have your values or your understanding of the way life works or your language, you can see why it would start to create friction amongst all these various groups. And the reality of it is the impact of rail travel on Wales is lasting. Even today, routes like the Heart of Wales line in the Cambrian coastline preserve the steam services and attract tourists from around the world. These journeys, now heritage routes, owe their existence to the Victorians who first envisioned this travel for pleasure rather than necessity. One modern echo is in the story of David High, a 20th century preservationist who helped save the Taliesin Railway in the 1950s. His efforts launched the UK Heritage Railway movement. The Taliesin has begun a life in 1865 as a slate line in mid Wales, but it became a beloved tourist line largely due to the post-war nostalgia for Victorian steam. Wales today embraces this dual identity, both as an industrial heartland and romantic escape. I think embrace can be a bit of a strong word, but I think there is some of that. The balance between preserving culture and inviting the world is still felt in debates around tourism, infrastructure, and identity. And I think it's something to be aware of if you are from outside of the community and you're coming in for a holiday or whatever, or you just want to see Wales, be mindful that not everybody's happy to see you there and that, you know, being a rowdy visitor probably not going to win you favor. It's always interesting when you look at this and you realize that the idea of a holiday is a modern invention. It's not that old. And our concept of it and the way we think of it now, where people just go to pick up and hop on an airplane and go somewhere with maybe a week's notice, maybe even less for some people, is not the norm that the population experienced until recent times. It just didn't happen. Without the ability to travel quickly, without the ability to travel safely, you could not do that. And that is the biggest change that comes through steam power. It allows for all of that to happen and be experienced, and it's something important to remember. So with all that said and done, thank you all for listening or viewing today. I hope you have a great day. We'll talk to you all later. Take care. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcasts is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.